So, as I was saying, revolutionary socialists like Marx and Engels believe that socialism can only come about through revolution, that is to say, an armed uprising by the working class, the proletariat, against the capitalist state. This belief was popular amongst most socialist groups during the mid-19th century for three main reasons, I would argue. First of all, working and living conditions for the working class at that point were so abysmal that they inevitably pushed the industrial proletariat in the direction of revolt and revolution. Wages were low, kind of starvation level wages. Hours were very long. The poverty was grinding. Workers were rarely paid enough to properly feed their families, and child deaths through malnutrition were common. There were no, or at least minimal, regulations of working conditions, and accidents or even deaths in mines and factories in industrial Europe were very frequent. This led many socialists to agree with Marx that, quote, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. In other words, their lives were already so miserable that risking all on a revolution may have seemed a risk worth taking. Secondly, in most countries, there was simply no other way of bringing about socialism. That was because workers did not have the vote. The franchise was limited to property owners, and therefore there were no democratic means available for workers to elect socialist governments. If socialism were to be achieved, then it would have to be by force. This is still the case, of course, in non-democratic countries today. Just pause the video here, a little bit of revision, and see if you can remember when workers, any working class people, first got the vote in the UK. Pause the video, see if you can remember now. Did you get it? It was actually the second Reform Act, the one pushed through by Benjamin Disraeli in 1867, was the first time workers got the vote in the UK. And even then it was less than half even of the male workforce. There was still a property qualification. The property qualification was not ended for men until 1918 and for women 1928. But there was no vote for any working class person in the UK before 1867. Anyway, third reason is that that many socialists supported revolution, is that particularly for Marxists believe that it's to do with their view of the state. The class nature of the state, according to Marxists, meant that only revolution could bring about the far-reaching changes they desired. So Marxists, this is important to note, Marxists do not see the state as a kind of neutral tool of the government. The state apparatus, remember what we mean by the state, the police, the army, the institutions that enforce the government's will on society, the army, the police, the judiciary, the prison system, all of this stuff. They don't see the state as the neutral tool of the government, but rather as an instrument of class oppression created by a particular class for the domination of society, for that class to dominate the others, a means by one class to repress the others. So from this point of view, the bourgeois state that came about following the Glorious Revolution in 1688 in the UK, for example, does not need to be taken over as such, but actually destroyed and replaced by a new proletarian state. That's the Marxist view. And this is precisely what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. The Bolsheviks, they didn't come to government and then just start directing the existing state. They created a new army, a new police force, and so on. There was actually a civil war in which they crushed the old army of the Tsar. They created a new people's army, working class army, a new police force, and so on, composed of the working class, and therefore seen as more sympathetic to the aims of socialism. Marxists believe that if a socialist government is elected and attempts to create socialism by decree, by parliamentary legislation, the bourgeois state will either refuse to implement it or will actually use that state to overthrow the government. And this is exactly what happened in Chile in 1973, when the elected socialist government of Salvador Allende was overthrown by its own military. Because the military, in Marxist terms, the military was more sympathetic to the bourgeois class, was not sympathetic to the socialist government of Allende, so actually overthrew that government, and Pinochet was installed as a military dictator. Other even non-Marxists have drawn attention as well to this idea that the state bureaucracy has a kind of entrenched class interest in capitalism. Ralph Miliband, for example, father of the recent Labour leader Ed Miliband, he had this analysis that the kind of bureaucracy, the civil service and so on, is sort of inherently conservative, instinctively pro-capitalist and reluctant to introduce radical socialist reforms and so on. But for Marxists in particular, the state is seen as an instrument for one class to dominate and repress another. And therefore you can't just take over the bourgeois state apparatus, you have to destroy it, create a new one. And that's why electing a socialist government will not work, and you need a revolution. Okay, thanks for listening.